Remember the battles that you have fought in the past, and bear yourself like brave men who are worthy of your reputation and your country. Keep this fact before your eyes, that if you overcome the enemy, not only will you be complete masters of Africa, but you will win for yourselves and for Rome the unchallenged leadership and sovereignty of the rest of the world. Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, soon to be known forever as Scipio Africanus, speaking to his men before the final battle of the Second Punic War at Zama in modern-day Tunisia. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. This is the 20th episode of the Roman Empire podcast series. In this episode, we will cover the final years of the Second Punic War, in which an exhausted Rome defeated an even more exhausted Carthage and became the sole master of the Western Mediterranean. Before we continue, please remember to check out the website for the podcast. It's western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org. There you will find all the episodes, as well as a merchandise page where you can purchase hats, t-shirts, and so on with the Western Traditions logo. If you wish to support the podcast directly, please consider the PayPal or Patreon options. Patreon supporters get behind-the-scenes access to the podcast, as well as raw audio and video links to the podcast that you can listen to directly without hearing advertisements. I also post interesting essays and history links and resources there on the website. You can also listen to the podcast on Spotify, on YouTube, on Amazon Music, and many other platforms. Wherever you listen, please remember to share, like, subscribe, and comment. These are free ways to help support the podcast. Now, though, after having slogged through this war between Rome and Carthage for so long, let's finish this epic. Let's invade Africa. The strain on these two enemies, Rome and Carthage, is possibly something we cannot even begin to imagine. In the 20th century, the world witnessed and participated in a period of total war in which entire nations mobilized and men and women into industry and warfare at a scale that had not been seen in recent memory. But World War II lasted only 6 years, and two of the largest participants in the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, were involved for fewer years than that. The Second Punic War, however, lasted a full 17 years. Rome suffered losses in single battles, which actually amounted to whole percentage points of their total adult male population. Early on in the war, in fact, it is estimated that they had already lost about 1/5 of their adult male population to combat. Financially, Rome was also bankrupt. Emergency funds from the Republic's treasury had been dispensed and exhausted. As we will hear soon, the Senate was not even able to build or man the fleets that had characterized the First Punic War. Some areas of operation did not even have naval cover. They were simply left open to Carthaginian opportunists. Since Carthage was ultimately destroyed in the Third Punic War in the next century, we have little to go on with regard to Carthage's expenses, but we know that they must have been incredible also, paying tens of thousands of mercenaries for so many years, building entire fleets to replace the ships that the Romans had captured or sunk. Conflicts like this are won by the last man standing, and conversely, it is that last man standing, exhausted as he may be, who will come away with the greatest treasure and power. That is what Rome eventually found itself fighting for, to outlast Carthage and to reap an entire world as bounty. Perhaps Hannibal's greatest error was in underestimating the endlessness of Rome's supply of men. Who could have known that Roman farms would continue to generously offer up the fruit of their loins year after year to field legion after legion, and that those young men would not be intimidated by the massacre of last year's crop and go willingly into another battle with Hannibal, a battle which Hannibal would almost invariably win, but each time he would suffer losses that he often could not replace, and spend money that he would then need to find elsewhere, while the Roman tide simply kept coming and coming. And as time went by, those young Roman men who survived battles with Hannibal, many of them would remember their mistakes. They would rise through the ranks from centurion on up to even become elected or appointed officials in charge of larger units of men, even over entire legions. And their generals and consuls would find these men capable of operating independently, of carrying out complex tactical maneuvers, and Hannibal and his brothers and his fellow Carthaginian generals would have no real answer to this development. Perhaps, given Rome's durability then, it is less significant that Carthage failed so spectacularly to support her own war efforts. Hannibal, in his nearly 15-year sojourn in Italy, he received virtually nothing in terms of support. If we put on our bean counter hats and get technical, then we discover that Carthage sent to Hannibal, in all his years in fighting in Italy, a grand total of 4,000 men and a handful of elephants. And this was after Cannae, the greatest battlefield victory of Carthage's history, the battle in which he seems to have nearly shattered all hope for Rome. Meanwhile, over the same time period, Carthage sent nearly 80,000 reinforcements, including several dozen elephants, to Spain to defend their possessions there, possessions which they eventually lost anyway. Now, this war, along with many others, of course, has long been a teacher to military thinkers. Aim for the heart of the matter is the lesson here. Do not simply defend what is yours or try to take pieces of land from an enemy. Strike the enemy a blow so hard at his very core that he will give you everything in exchange for very few losses of your own and for the loss of much less time, blood, and treasure. So think many military historians today who, looking back, agree with Hannibal's lieutenant, Maharbal. He told his commander after the victory at Cannae, when Hannibal turned down the opportunity to strike at the city of Rome, he said, "You, Hannibal, know how to win a victory, but not how to use one." Hannibal and Carthage, the thinking goes, should have focused on knocking over the big pin, the capital of the Roman Republic, instead of tearing away pieces of her realm and hoping she would fall to internal sedition and rebellion. But again, maybe it was a fool's venture from the start, Hannibal's roll of the dice in invading Italy. Maybe there was no amount of reinforcements and money and terror that was going to make the Romans surrender. Knowing your enemy is also an important part of being a military commander. Hannibal possessed a superb intelligence service. He generally knew very well where each Roman unit was, who commanded it, how many men they numbered. But did he know their hearts? Did he know how much strain their resilience could take and still keep fighting? Scipio's official consular year was not what you might have expected, given the build-up that I have made for it. Being given permission to invade Africa was one thing. Preparing an army and a fleet and funding to do so is quite another. Remember that Rome's finances were strained and that her navy was stretched thin. In the First Punic War, we saw huge fleets from each side built and sent into harm's way. Hundreds of ships might go to the bottom of the ocean in a single sea battle. Neither side, neither Carthage nor Rome, could afford such expense in money and manpower now. Scipio was able to acquire about 30 warships that were lying idle and unmanned in Rome's port city of Ostia. With these and a lot of transports, he did manage to escort the transportation of his consular army to Sicily, since a full-scale invasion of Carthage with these resources was unthinkable. But at least there in Sicily, he was just one more sea passage away from his goal. Now, once in Sicily, Scipio sent his best friend and second-in-command, Gaius Laelius, in command of those warships to begin raiding the African coast in preparation for an invasion. And here again, we see how changed circumstances, how changed resources and supplies can alter the battlefield. Not long ago, these two enemies had assembled fleets of hundreds of ships for a single battle, but now everyone was stretched thin, so thin that Rome could only assign 30 ships to raid Africa and to raid Carthage. Carthage, which at the moment had virtually nothing available to stop those 30 ships. Meanwhile, though, Carthage had not given up. That same year, Hannibal's youngest brother, Magobarca, and 30 Carthaginian ships suddenly appeared off the coast of northwestern Italy with some 14,000 troops aboard. Mago had been able to pull off this feat because Rome, stretched thin as I said, was no longer maintaining strong patrols in that area. Every last ship and sailor was already more urgently needed elsewhere. Now he quickly captured the city of Genoa. Then Mago began recruiting locals to build an even larger army and to then invade Italy in support of his older brother, with whom he hoped to reunite someday. As if such a beginning to Scipio's invasion effort was not inauspicious enough, now that Scipio was gone, certain tribes in Spain decided to revolt. They were only put down after a vicious battle which required both remaining Roman legions in the territory and all their Spanish allies to win. In the end, the rebels asked for peace terms and were required to double their already heavy tributes and to surrender hostages to Rome. The Spanish were already learning about the dubious opportunity of Roman alliance. And then, before any invasion of Africa could take place, an ugly and regrettable incident happened in southern Italy, and Scipio signed off on it. Scipio was in Syracuse that year. Historians depict him, after enduring years on the battlefield in Spain, now enjoying his leisure in that Greek cultural center. Here he dressed according to Greek fashion, and he exercised at the local gymnasium. While savoring these amusements, the new consul was contacted and alerted to the possibility of recovering the city of Locri for Rome. Now, early in the war, after the Roman defeat at Cannae, many cities in southern Italy either came over to the Carthaginians voluntarily or they were seized by Hannibal's men. In the case of the city of Locri, the Carthaginian general Hanno had taken control of the city during the winter after Cannae, and ever since it had supported the Carthaginian forces in Italy. So Scipio, though his focus was supposed to be on invading Africa, he authorized the sending of a detachment of troops to seize the town of Locri. When he learned that Hannibal himself was approaching to relieve the city, Scipio then departed from Sicily with reinforcements and arrived at the battle for Locri, literally just a few hours after Hannibal had arrived. And in a battle about which amazingly little seems to be written, Scipio attacked Hannibal's forces, and the Carthaginian military genius was forced to retreat and to completely surrender the city to the Romans. Immediately afterward, Scipio executed certain citizens who had supported Carthage, and then he left the city's overall fate in the hands of the Senate. This was standard Roman practice. Then, leaving a legate or lieutenant by the name of Plaminius in charge of the city, Scipio returned to Sicily to continue organizing his invasion. Disorder followed. Scipio's legate Plaminius oversaw the pillaging of the city and even the plunder of the local temple of Persephone, something which even the Carthaginians had not done. Then, in the chaos which ensued, the Roman soldiers began to turn on each other. The tribunes, who were officers of high but not the highest rank and who were elected by the popular assemblies, they quarreled with Plaminius. This legate, whom Scipio had left in charge, ordered troops that were loyal to him to scourge the tribunes, and then the men loyal to the tribunes attacked Plaminius and mutilated his face. Scipio learned of all this dissension, and he returned quickly to Locri. Now, in keeping with his character, Scipio sided with Plaminius, his legate, and he restored his command before departing once again. This lieutenant then turned on the tribunes who had stood against him, and he had them tortured and killed. He tossed their bodies out in the open and ordered that their corpses be left unburied. Then Plaminius turned his fury on the surviving populace of the city. When news of this pandemonium reached Rome and the Senate, there was an uproar. And so a potentially great hero's name was sullied and his ascent to glory was delayed and almost sidetracked for good. For whatever reasons, the invasion of Africa did not come off that year, though Scipio's ships did raid the Carthaginian coastline, and now Scipio found himself, just like many a politician today, in a public scandal that tarnished his reputation. We must remember that, although Locri had been under Carthaginian control, men of that city had betrayed the Carthaginians and helped return the Romans to power there. Furthermore, Locri was not some foreign city that could be subjected to the legalized annihilation about which I spoke in the last episode. These people had essentially been Romans. To execute the leaders who had openly cooperated with Hannibal was one thing. To pillage the town and to desecrate a temple was something else entirely. Perhaps Scipio had been too focused on his invasion plans to take seriously what some of his junior officers were up to, or perhaps, as his detractors claimed, he was distracted by Greek luxury while living in Syracuse. Either way, the year petered away and no invasion happened. The time for next year's elections rolled around. Scipio knew that he would not be re-elected consul, but he hoped for a proconsular post, that is, to remain in power over his army, even though he would not be one of the two consuls for the coming year 204 BC. To keep his command, though, Scipio had to survive an inquiry. Again, we have seen this in our own time when politicians and other public officials are called before legislative bodies or otherwise subjected to investigations. A party of commissioners was sent to Locri. Stolen property was returned to the citizens. Flaminius and others in his command were sent back to Rome to be tried for crimes against gods and men. The same commission was then sent on to Sicily to inquire about allegations that Scipio's army had devolved into a chaotic and undisciplined force while vacationing among the Greeks. This last charge fell flat. The commission returned to Rome with a report full of admiration for the high state of readiness among Scipio's soldiers. Indeed, if we are to believe the Roman historians, it was at this juncture that the Senate agreed to release the Cannae legions from their exile in Sicily and to give them an opportunity to reaffirm their valor in battle on African soil. If you remember, the Roman legions which turned and ran at the defeat in Cannae over a decade before had been sent to Sicily, and here they had served as guards of that grain-producing island, but they had also been living out a sentence of exile, forbidden, each and every one of them, from returning to Rome until some way to expiate their shame might be found. Such a way had been found in the invasion of Africa, and ships as well as men were found. Though his path to glory had foundered a bit, in the end Scipio got everything he wanted. He was granted proconsular command, and Rome was ready to throw everything, men, ships, and money, at Carthage in order to bring an end to this brutal war. Even though Hannibal still roamed southern Italy with his army and his brother Mago had landed in northern Italy with another army, the Senate funded and prepared transports to carry Scipio's men, who numbered somewhere between 25 and 30,000 total, including the Cannae legions, as well as 2 squadrons of warships to escort these troops over to Africa sometime in the early summer of 204 BC. Just as in our day, there were political scandals in ancient Rome, as evidenced by the investigation into Scipio's actions and non-actions with regard to the massacre at Locri. And there were cover-ups, too. And if Scipio had not covered up a certain fact at this time, the outcome of the war might have been completely different. Shortly before embarking his troops, Scipio received an embassy from Syphax, that Numidian king whom Scipio had hoped would come to his aid during an invasion. Recall that from the last episode, Scipio had crossed over from Spain to Africa 2 years before to ensure that Syphax would be on his side during some future final assault against Carthage. Syphax's ambassadors passed on a message to Scipio. The Numidian king revealed his own last-minute siding with Carthage, and he urged Scipio to accept peace terms, to not cross the sea, to not invade. As it turned out, Carthage had played another card in this long game of war. Hasdrubal Gisgo, the other Hasdrubal, not Hannibal's brother, but rather the other Carthaginian general of the same name during the war in Spain, he had given Sophonisba, his beautiful young daughter, in marriage to Syphax. He had sacrificed her, in a sense, to save his country. And now the old Numidian king was spellbound by this beautiful young woman, and, of course, completely committed to a new alliance with Carthage. The Carthaginians had pulled off a diplomatic coup just in time. Now the Romans would be landing on a foreign shore with two powerful realms in league against them. Scipio still had the support of Massinissa, another Numidian warlord, but Massinissa had been exiled a few years ago by Syphax and the Carthaginians, and he would be able to provide very few men to assist the Romans once they landed. Scipio therefore wisely chose to tell his army that the embassy from Syphax had urged him to hurry up and strike the last blow, and so Scipio hurried his men onto their ships and set sail. The Carthaginian navy was now so depleted, however, that there was virtually no resistance to Scipio's passage. The Roman fleet made landing not far from Utica, a city just 30 miles up the coast from Carthage. Scipio had decided to try to capture this city and make it his base of operations against the capital to the south. The Romans were immediately joined by the Numidian Massinissa, who may have brought along with him no more than 200 horsemen, so low had his fortunes fallen while waiting for Scipio to cross the sea and come to his aid. Together, then, they made war on the countryside around Utica. The Carthaginians sent a probe to test the Romans, about 4,000 troops under the general Hanno. These were mostly Numidians, but also included some men of noble Carthaginian families who were now thrown into battle with the safety of their homeland on the line. In an engagement known as the Battle of the Tower of Agathocles, Scipio routed this force. The general Hanno was killed in the battle, and only about 1,000 of the Carthaginian troops escaped alive. However, despite this resounding victory and a constant wealth of supplies being shipped over from Rome, Scipio was not able to take the town of Utica. He besieged it, but soon Hasdrubal and Syphax arrived on the scene with their formidable armies. Scipio was forced to withdraw to Castra Cornelia, a fortified camp that he had built on the coast. Over the winter that followed, Syphax, Rome's former ally, now married to that Carthaginian princess, he entered into negotiations with Scipio. The Roman proconsul had hoped to detach Syphax once again from his alliance with Carthage, but Syphax made a counterproposal. Rome would remove troops from Africa, and Carthage would evacuate Italy. Each side would be free to develop their empires, Rome in Europe and Carthage in Africa. That was the compromise. Now, Scipio pretended to be interested in this tame ending to the war, and he used the delay caused by the negotiations to infiltrate the enemy camp with some of his junior officers, who disguised themselves as slaves. These men noted every detail of the camps. More importantly, they realized that the enemy army had built its camp fortifications entirely from wood, using sticks and reeds from the countryside, and avoiding almost entirely the use of earthen works like the Romans typically did. Furthermore, all this time, Scipio was sending scouts to study the terrain and the approaches to the Carthaginian and Numidian camps. So winter passed, and the Carthaginians began to be under the impression that Scipio was probably going to accept the peace offering and to depart from Africa. But one night in March, Scipio and his men marched quickly out of Castra Cornelia. Some of his forces carried fuel and fire with them, and once they were upwind of the Numidian camp, they began throwing burning wood into the fortifications. Soon the entire structure was ablaze, as were the soldiers' quarters inside the walls. The shocked enemy troops, weaponless, confused and terrified by the raging flames, streamed chaotically out into the darkness of night, where they were cut down by the waiting Romans. In one night, in a battle that is known as the Burning of the Camps, an entire Carthaginian army had ceased to exist. Hasdrubal and Syphax were able to escape, however, and they assisted in rallying what few remnants of the army there were. In the city of Carthage, after the battle, there was panic. Many among the ruling class wanted to recall Hannibal from Italy in order for him and his army to defend their city. Another battle on the plains north of Carthage followed that year, and the Romans were victorious again. Syphax fled the region, and Massinissa and a detachment of Roman legionaries were sent to follow him deep into his territory, where he was again defeated and then captured. Syphax, now a prisoner, was transported back to Italy, where he would die without ever seeing Numidia again. The Numidian capital surrendered, but not before one last bit of romantic drama. Massinissa arrived there first, before the Romans, and he entered and was received by the grieving widow of Syphax, the beautiful young Carthaginian princess Sophonisba. Massinissa took her in marriage immediately, possibly out of love or possibly due to political aspiration, thinking that a marriage with her would help solidify his hold on the throne over all Numidians. Possibly both things were true. But word quickly got back to Scipio that Sophonisba lived and had become his ally's wife. Scipio sent a message making his viewpoint clear. This marriage would not stand. Sophonisba, the daughter of Hannibal Gisgo, who had seduced Syphax from Roman alliance, was not a suitable mate for the new king of Numidia and ally of Rome. Shortly thereafter, Sophonisba turned her sacrifice for Carthage into a true blood offering. She drank poison and passed away along with the rest of Carthage's geopolitical influence. In the meantime, Scipio and his legions moved southward and took the city of Tunis, which the Carthaginians had abandoned militarily. This new base was now only 15 miles from Carthage, and possession of it also meant that the capital was now cut off from the interior of Africa. The Carthaginians then made a bold attempt to reverse their fortunes. They had assembled a small fleet at Carthage. While much of the Roman army was at Tunis, the Roman port and supply base remained near Utica in the north, next to their camp Castra Cornelia. Carthage sent the fleet to attack this port and possibly cut the Romans off from their supply lines, trapping them in Africa. Any hope they might have had for this strategy was short-lived. Scipio was warned about the fleet's departure. He sent messengers racing ahead to Utica to warn the other portion of his army there, and he followed them at the head of a column of reinforcements. Even though the Carthaginians were traveling by sea and could get there first, they delayed long enough to allow the Roman sailors at the port to lash their ships together and to form a defensive posture. The Carthaginians were able to damage many transports in the subsequent attack, and they hauled away another 60 vessels along with prisoners, but no damage was done to the actual Roman warships. Soon Scipio arrived with more troops, and any hope of victory by surprise was gone. The Carthaginian fleet retired to Carthage, victorious, but not victorious enough. The Carthaginian rulers could see the writing on the wall, and now they sent 30 ambassadors to the Roman camp. These men threw themselves prostrate before Scipio and begged for peace. He offered them harsh terms. Complete abandonment of all lands in Europe and the islands. Numidia was to be recognized as a sovereign territory under Roman ally Massinissa. The Carthaginian navy was to be reduced to a small defensive force. There was also to be the usual release of prisoners, an indemnity of 5,000 talents, exorbitant pay to be given to the Roman soldiers in Africa, and more. Carthage accepted with little hesitation. Simultaneously, the Senate in Carthage recalled both Hannibal and Mago, bringing them back to Africa, both to represent them and to defend them if necessary. According to one account, Mago, the younger brother of Hannibal, he died of battle wounds while making the crossing, and he never saw his home again, though his army made it home safe and sound. We do know that Hannibal, however, he did arrive in Carthage intact with the remnants of his army sometime that autumn. He reorganized his army and that of his brother Mago and other forces into one unit and made his base at a city called Hadrumetum. And it might have all ended there, all the bloodshed and the hatred. Carthaginian representatives were in Rome late that year, and they presented the peace terms that they had accepted to the Roman Senate. The Senate ratified the peace gladly. As Scipio had known, everyone was exhausted by this war, and there was little push to make the peace terms any harsher. But while this ratification was underway, a Roman supply convoy to the army in Africa was blown off course and shipwrecked on the Carthaginian shore. The nearby African populace, nearly starved by the war conditions, could not resist. They sent out men and ships to recover these wrecks and several other ships that were stranded in the shallow water near the shore after the storm. They took all the provisions and even attacked a ship sent by Scipio to protest this irrigation of Roman supplies. This was a slap in the face when Carthage was supposed to be on its knees. The war was back on. The epilogue to this failed peace is dramatic but short-lived. Africa was actually given as a province to a new consul elected for the year 202 BC, but Scipio was left in charge until this new consul might arrive. But the new consul bided his time, and then weather forced him to lay up in Sardinia with his fleet, and this left Scipio with a free hand in Africa for another year. Now, knowing that Hannibal was in Carthage preparing an army, Scipio marched around the African interior, raiding and pillaging towns, hoping to provoke Hannibal to come out and do battle. But Hannibal would not be hurried. He continued drilling his troops and waited for the arrival of more cavalry, most of them Numidians who were still sympathetic to Carthage. And when he was ready, sometime probably in October of 202 BC, Hannibal marched out into the country to find the Romans. He ordered his army into battle formation somewhere near the town of Zama, not far from where the main body of the Romans had made their latest camp. And then Hannibal asked to speak with Scipio. The two generals, each of them wielding the greatest military power available to their respective sides in the war, they met on horseback at a spot between the two armies in formation. They each came to this meeting alone, except for interpreters. When they approached one another, Hannibal saluted Scipio. The Carthaginian spoke first, and the following is a portion of that speech as given by Polybius. We went to war to decide the possession of Sicily, and afterwards that of Spain, and both of us have ignored the lessons of fortune. Finally, we have reached the point at which one of us has risked the safety of his native soil in the past, while the other is doing so at this moment. What remains for us, then, but to consider by what means we can avert the wrath of the gods and reconcile our present rivalry? I myself am ready to make the attempt, since I have learned by actual experience how fickle is fortune, how she sports with mankind as if her victims were little children. I am that Hannibal who after the Battle of Cannae became master of almost the whole of Italy, who later advanced up to Rome itself, pitched camp within 5 miles of her walls, and there took thought as to how I should deal with you and your country. Today, I am here in Africa on the point of negotiating with you, a Roman, concerning my country's very existence and my own. Remember this change of fortune, I beg you, and do not be overproud. Follow that course which will produce the most good and the fewest evil consequences. There was a little more than this in his speech, including another offer to restrict Carthage to her African domain and to surrender Europe and the islands to Rome. But more importantly, we must remember that this is really a Roman speech put into the mouth of a Carthaginian by Polybius. Hannibal may have really said these things, but it is most important for our purposes to see how much importance Polybius and his Roman audience put on the idea of fortune. I have mentioned this more than once, the Roman fascination with the idea of the turning wheel of fortune. As Hannibal is reported to have said, fortune had once favored him, and now, in the natural order of things, it favored another man. We like to think, you see, that we are in control of our destinies, that hard work, a lot of money, more guns, these things will protect us from a hard fate. But the Romans knew that it was all a matter of fortune, that the turning wheel of the universe eventually turned against everyone. Some 7 centuries later, the philosopher and Christian martyr Boethius, who is sometimes called the last Roman, will expound famously on this topic of fortune, which seems to have never left the Roman mind. Now, though, Scipio responded to Hannibal, first noting that, all philosophical verbiage aside, Carthage had been the aggressor in both Punic wars, and he stated that the gods had given victory not to those who had struck the first blow, but rather to those who had taken up arms to defend themselves. And yes, he knew all about fortune, but in a typically Roman way, Scipio got straight to the point. Carthage had already agreed to much harsher terms than Hannibal was suggesting now, and for Rome to accept these new terms would be to simply reward the Carthaginians for their treachery. What further purpose, then, does our conference serve? Scipio asked. The fact is that you must either put yourself and your country unconditionally into our hands, or else fight and conquer us. There was no more to be said. The two great men parted ways then and returned to their respective camps. When the sun came up next, it would be battle morning. Now met two armies with dramatic histories. On the Roman side, the core of the army was made up of the Cannae legions. After the terrible defeat at Cannae some 14 years earlier, the Roman soldiers and the legions present there had fled the field of battle, and according to the semi-legendary story that we possess, there were some 8 legions total at that battle. The survivors of Rome's greatest defeat had then been reformed, possibly into just 2 new legions, and sent to Sicily, forbidden to return to Rome until freed from the punishment inflicted on them by the Senate for their failure on the battlefield. Only Scipio's need and the opportunity to invade Africa had freed the men from their exile, but they had to pass through Carthage, so to speak, before they could go home. Now, I believe the core of this story, but we must remember that 14 years had passed. Surely the Cannae legions had been supplemented over all that time with fresh blood in some way, and any remaining soldiers from Cannae at that point would have been quite a bit older, which is not at the same time that hard to believe. Unlike in many modern armies, the ranks back then were not made up of a bunch of young men fresh out of high school. There were very young men in these ancient armies, yes, but such armies frequently included men even older than 40 years, even among the regular soldiers, not just the officer class. The Roman formations, in fact, as I've described before, included portions which were exclusively older soldiers, known as the triarii, making up the third reserve line of a legion. But the Cannae legions would have been by then entirely made up of such older soldiers, which seems hard to believe unless there had been some reorganization of the legions down through the years. Nevertheless, whatever the truth was here, Scipio's army was not just the Cannae legions. Scipio had recruited and trained others, and during the more than 1 year that he had had these units under his command, he had probably weeded out many men now unsuitable for combat. Still, it is compelling to think that many of the men on the field that day remembered their disgrace at Cannae and looked forward to redemption. It is estimated that Scipio commanded about 30,000 troops at this final battle. As for Hannibal, he had also supplemented his army with a lot of fresh blood and with new allies in Africa, but the core of his force was the army of Italy, the mercenary army that he had built up and led over the course of more than 15 years in Spain and Gaul and finally Italy. Hannibal outnumbered Scipio, possibly having 40,000 troops or more with him at Zama, but many of these men were untested, and others were mercenaries who might not have had the highest morale fighting for the side that had done really nothing but lose for several years now. Some were, in fact, native Carthaginians, patriotically motivated, yes, but unused to warfare, even though Hannibal had been at pains to train them as much as possible. Furthermore, the Carthaginian army was hopelessly diverse. The Romans had a strong core of native Italians, supplemented by allies. The core of Hannibal's force was the army of Italy, which was itself a mercenary army made up of foreigners. Not only did it include the men who had come with him from Spain and those recruited in Gaul, but it also contained a large element of men from southern Italy who had joined during the period of Carthaginian dominance in that country, and many of these men, like the Cannae legions, were much older. Describing this motley crew, Polybius quotes Homer in his description of the Trojan army. Here there was no common language. Many and strange were the tongues of this host, many and far off their lands. Hannibal's battle plan, though, ruthlessly favored his beloved army of Italy. He planned for his other units to meet the Romans head-on, to sacrifice these units, basically, in order to weaken and to slow the Roman advance, before he could then unleash his veteran mercenaries. Additionally, that day, Hannibal also fielded some 4,000 Numidian cavalry and possibly as many as 80 battle elephants. This was the last Carthaginian reserve thrown into the final battle to save the city. In other circumstances, this might have been an effective battle strategy. Indeed, the Roman advance was delayed and distorted because the legionaries had to walk over the wounded bodies and the corpses of so many men before they finally encountered the waiting army of Italy. As for the elephants, the Romans had already learned how to neutralize this arm of Carthaginian weaponry. Nevertheless, Scipio had to order a halt midway through the battle so that his men could rally and reform before advancing against Hannibal's corps. And then it was a savage hand-to-hand bloodbath. The army of Italy eventually broke under the massive weight of the Roman attack. By this time, the remainder of Hannibal's forces were scattered or dead, and these hardy veterans of Hannibal's adventures, perhaps less than 12,000 men, were ultimately hemmed in and overwhelmed by the organized, relentless Roman assault. To put it simply, the Carthaginians were annihilated by a supremely drilled and prepared Roman army. Casualties for Carthage that day are estimated at over 20,000. The Romans are said to have lost just 1,500 men in the battle. And this disparity in the numbers of casualties should not spur us to disbelief. As I have commented before in this podcast, battles often worked out this way. When one side lost its morale and broke to run, the real slaughter would begin, and the losing side would suddenly experience horrific casualties. This is why military leaders tried to make organized retreats to preserve the integrity and the numbers of their armies. Hannibal survived the battle, retreating first to his base at Hadrumetum and then to the city of Carthage, responding to the summons from the Senate there. Now, he had not been inside those city walls for 35 years. He was now in his mid-40s, head of a finally and completely defeated army. But Hannibal was not brought back to Carthage to be crucified, as other generals might have feared. No, he was called there to give counsel, and he did. He counseled surrender. The sight of a Roman fleet now sailing within sight of the city might have encouraged the Senate of Carthage to agree. The terms given to the Carthaginians now were even harsher than before. 10,000 talents to be paid, noble hostages to be surrendered and transported to Rome. Not only was Carthage not to make war without Roman permission now, they were not even allowed to train men up to war without permission. The new Carthaginian borders were now to be within that area called the Phoenician Trenches, which was an ancient border that demarcated a territory much smaller than the Romans had previously planned on allowing to Carthage. In essence, the peace treaty created a small rump state around the city of Carthage that was to be almost completely subservient to Rome. When the city council came together to discuss the terms, it is said that one man among them stood to protest the terms as too humiliating to accept and to suggest that Carthage keep fighting. Hannibal quickly crossed the room and essentially tackled the man. There was only one option: surrender, or soon the Romans would be at their walls. The Second Punic War was finally over. William Butler Yeats was an early 20th century Irish poet. In one of his more famous poems, titled Easter 1916, he remarks on how the violent events of the Irish Revolution changed his country and his culture with these lines: "All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born." And so is Rome changed into something both terrible and beautiful. We will look back on this coming post-war period, most of the 2nd century BC really, as a sort of high mark for Roman society, when there was a meeting between that famously stoic Roman character and the vast wealth needed to give that character power and influence throughout the known world. The world itself is changed at this time too, or it finds the roots of its transformation here anyway. Stemming from this convulsive period of Western history is not just the Roman Empire that's coming, but the Middle Ages that follow, and the modern period into which the world entered after that Middle Age. I mean, however much certain historical and archaeological periods and cultures of the past may contribute to our present civilization, however much we may think that we owe culturally to this or that Egyptian, African, Greek, Mesopotamian, Celtic, or other ancient culture, Rome remains our root, the trunk of our tree, and it remains so because of this long war and that final victory at Zama. It is only after this that Rome is capable of authoritatively branching out into the rest of the Mediterranean, into Europe and into Asia. Now, the ending of the war was obvious that autumn after the battle, but all the communications and ratifications and the back and forth across the ocean expanses were not finalized until early in 201 BC, when the war's ending became official after being accepted by both governments in Rome and Carthage. In total, then, the Second Punic War had officially lasted 17 years. However, the war's ending did not bring peace. As I will show in the coming episodes, Rome was already simultaneously engaged in war with Macedonia. The First Macedonian War had ended the year before Scipio invaded Africa, but the second war in that series of Greek conflicts would break out anew in 200 BC, and Roman legions would again be fielded to face a foreign enemy. Yes, even though I have pointed out multiple times how exhausted Roman manpower must have been by the end of the Second Punic War, they were still willing and able to ship out more legions the following year. And Massinissa, the new king of Numidia, would be busy taking advantage of Carthage's enforced weakness and her inability to raise an army in order to chip away at her reduced territory. As for our war heroes, Scipio and Hannibal, life went on. Publius Cornelius Scipio would hereafter be known to Rome and to history as Scipio Africanus, gaining a new cognomen that defined his achievements and set him apart from all other Scipios. In a couple of years, he would be elected censor of Rome, a post which was really the most important Roman office, even more valued than the consulship, since this official could unilaterally penalize even the highest aristocrats of Rome. He could reduce men in rank and could even remove them from the Senate if he thought their conduct was inappropriate. And then Scipio would be elected consul again not long after that. As for Hannibal, he found a way to be successful even in defeat. Rather than suffer punishment for his failure to defeat Rome, he was elected as a shofete, essentially something like a consul in Carthage the year after the surrender. He helped in that office to arrange the payment of the indemnity owed to Rome according to the peace treaty. He reorganized state finances so that Carthage could economically survive its punishment. Now, both of these men, Scipio and Hannibal, will have long and complicated histories in the decades to come, which I will briefly detail in a coming episode. But one more thing about the changes wrought by the war's ending and by Rome's victory. In 203 BC, when Scipio had not quite finished off the Carthaginian threat, his political rival, Fabius Maximus, known to history as Fabius the Delayer sometimes, had died of natural causes, an old man who had served Rome with the best years of his life. But during those years, Fabius had made sure that Rome also served him and his cause. The Fabian policy of war was not just a conservative approach to battlefield strategy. Over the course of the war, Fabius and his aristocratic colleagues in the Senate had acquired and solidified a power greater than they had ever possessed before. Think for a moment of how much more powerful the United States government was, even domestically, after its victory in World War II, when, for a short period, virtually the rest of the world lay in ruins and only the United States possessed viable industries and available manpower. This is comparable, perhaps, to the way that Rome survived the war, that the way that the Roman Senate had guided the ship of Rome through the greatest of storms, through the 17 years of this Second Punic War, and now the Senate and Roman civilization itself would reap the reward of a gratitude and a confidence and a patriotism among Roman commoners, and they would also reap the admiration of foreigners like it had never known before. If we are to believe Polybius in his representation of Scipio Africanus's last speech to his soldiers before the battle at Zama, then it seems like Roman leaders were already aware of this possible outcome of the war, that it would give them sovereignty over the world that they knew. Scipio told his soldiers in that speech, which I quoted at the very beginning of the podcast, that they were not just fighting for survival, that they would emerge from this victory as masters of the world. And this would also be, and more specifically be, a victory of the Roman aristocracy, which is ironic, really, since it was Scipio, who represented a more populist line of thought, who came out of the war as its greatest hero. But while he had been winning battles in Spain and Africa, the nobility of Rome had been slowly securing its dominance over the Senate and over the Republic, a dominance that would not be questioned for at least another half century. And this could not have been easy. However much we may decry the consolidation of power in aristocratic hands, as if any of us today really live in a democracy anyway, but however much we may lament this ancient power grab, we must admit that the Roman nobility had paid for it. Hundreds, possibly thousands of senators and senators' family members had died on the battlefield in this long war. They had paid for power with their own blood, as well as the blood of their fellow Romans. And now, in the coming decades, we can watch as even charismatic, well-bred men succumb to the vices brought on by the very wealth and power that they sought. Nevertheless, no matter what we think of these political issues, it is clear in hindsight that a golden age of Roman culture had arrived. Roman stolidity will meet and mingle with Greek curiosity, and coming episodes will delve into, among other things, the fruit of that cultural melange. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.